Welcome back to Life of Slaves. Today, we're traveling back to 1862 to explore the remarkable account of two young black twins who were declared gifted after a battery of tests left even the most seasoned experts completely baffled. However, the thing that truly propelled them to notoriety wasn't merely their intellect. It was the unthinkable secret concealed behind their results, something that was never intended to be documented. This story is difficult and powerful, so prepare yourself and listen carefully. Before we proceed, please subscribe and let me know in the comments which city and country you're tuning in from. Your support ensures these stories are remembered, not interred. Now, let's begin. On the morning of September 14, 1862, in a small coastal fishing village called Marblehead, Massachusetts, two black children were seated across from a white physician. This doctor had journeyed nearly 40 miles from Boston, specifically to meet them. His name was Dr. Nathaniel Warren. At 53 years old, he had dedicated his whole professional life to studying the human mind at Harvard Medical School. He'd conducted examinations on hundreds of patients. His papers had been published in medical journals throughout America and Europe. He'd witnessed phenomena that most people would simply refuse to believe. Yet, he had never encountered anything comparable to the Carter twins. These children were 8 years old. Their names were Elijah and Ruth. They remained perfectly motionless in their wooden chairs, hands clasped quietly in their laps, their dark eyes observing the doctor with a focus that made him feel uneasy. They didn't squirm. They didn't avert their gaze. They simply observed him as if they were the ones in charge of the examination. Dr. Warren opened his leather bag and withdrew a series of cards. Each card held a different mathematical problem. He'd personally designed these cards, organizing them from easiest to most difficult. The first few cards dealt with simple addition. The final cards contained equations that would challenge most university professors to solve without paper and pen. He gave the first card to the boy, Elijah. "Tell me the solution," Dr. Warren instructed. Elijah glanced at the card for maybe half a second. 23, he replied. The answer was accurate. Dr. Warren passed him the next card. Elijah answered before the doctor's hand had fully moved away. 57, again correct. They proceeded through the cards one after another, each turn presenting problems of greater complexity. Addition turned into subtraction. Subtraction turned into multiplication. Multiplication turned into division. Division turned into multi-step problems involving several operations. Elijah answered every single one without pausing. He never hesitated. He never made a single mistake. When they reached the final card, a problem that had taken Dr. Warren almost 3 minutes to solve when he first devised it, Elijah looked at the numbers for roughly 2 seconds. 439, he stated. Dr. Warren just stared at the boy. He consulted his answer key. He looked at it again. "That is correct," he finally said, his voice almost a whisper. Then he turned to Ruth, the girl, and took out a different collection of items from his bag. These weren't math problems. These were pages of text, copied from books Dr. Warren had chosen specifically, because they'd be completely foreign to any child. One page came from a Latin medical textbook. Another was a legal document packed with old-fashioned language. A third came from a philosophical treatise that employed vocabulary far beyond what an 8-year-old could normally grasp. He handed the Latin text to Ruth. "Read this," he said. Ruth looked at the page. She didn't know Latin. She had never learned Latin. She'd never even laid eyes on Latin text before that instant. But as she looked at the words, something happened. She began to sound them out, slowly at first, then with growing assurance. Her pronunciation wasn't flawless, but it was understandable. And even more strikingly, After reading each sentence out loud, she would stop and offer an interpretation of what the sentence might mean, based on the patterns she was noticing in the language. Several of her interpretations were right. Dr. Warren leaned back in his chair. His hands were shaking. In 3 decades of medical work, he'd never seen anything like this. He'd heard tales of children with extraordinary mental abilities, but he'd always dismissed them as wild stories or frauds. This was neither. He looked toward the twins' mother, a woman named Sarah Carter, who was standing in the corner of the little room, watching everything with an expression that combined pride and fear. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "how long have your children been capable of these things?" Sarah Carter was 31. She'd been born free in Massachusetts, the daughter of a black sailor and a Native American woman. She'd worked most of her life as a domestic servant, cleaning houses and washing laundry for white families who gave her barely enough to get by. She'd known her children were unusual since they were 3 years old. That's when Elijah began counting everything he saw, adding and multiplying numbers from everyday life, figuring out sums that Sarah couldn't even check. That's when Ruth started memorizing whole books after hearing them read just once, reciting passages word for word weeks or even months afterward. Sarah had done her best to conceal her children's abilities. She understood, in a way no white person truly could, how perilous it was for black children to seem too intelligent in America. In 1862, the nation was at war. The Civil War had started in April 1861, and now, 18 months later, the combat showed no signs of letting up. President Abraham Lincoln hadn't yet delivered his Emancipation Proclamation. In the southern states, 4 million black people were still enslaved. In the northern states, free black people lived in a fragile state, tolerated but not embraced, free but not equal. A black child who could read was a threat. A black child who could outthink white adults was beyond imagination. Sarah had kept her children's abilities concealed for 5 years. She had repeatedly told them they must never reveal what they could do. They had to act ordinary. They had to hide their talents. But secrets have a way of getting out. 3 weeks before Dr. Warren's visit, a white merchant named Thomas Aldrich had come to Sarah's modest house to drop off some fabric she'd ordered for her sewing. While Sarah was in the back room counting out coins to pay him, the merchant noticed Elijah sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a newspaper someone had left behind. The merchant chuckled. "Can you even read that, boy?" he'd asked, his voice full of contempt. Elijah looked up at him.
"Yes,"
he'd answered. "And there's an error in the 3rd paragraph. The reporter wrote that the Union forces captured 300 Confederate soldiers at the Battle of Antietam. But if you do the math, based on the numbers earlier in the article, the correct figure is 347. Thomas Aldrich just stared at the boy for a long while. Then he grabbed the newspaper and read the 3rd paragraph himself. He performed the calculations. The boy was correct. The merchant left the house without another word. But within days, the story had spread throughout Marblehead. The Black Widow's children could read. The Black Widow's children could calculate. The Black Widow's children possessed minds that appeared impossible to explain. Dr. Warren heard the tale from a colleague, who'd heard it from a patient, who'd heard it from a neighbor. At first, he dismissed it as gossip. But something about it stayed with him. Something made him unable to forget it. So he'd made the trip to Marblehead, and now he sat across from 2 children who had just displayed abilities that challenged everything he believed. He understood about the human mind. "Mrs. Carter," he repeated, "I need to know. How long have your children been able to do these things, and how is this possible?" Sarah Carter looked at her children. She looked at the doctor. She understood that whatever she said next would forever alter their lives. "They've always been like this," she said. "Since before they could walk, since before they could talk, they perceive things other people can't. They grasp things other people can't. I don't know why. I don't know how. I only know it's true." Dr. Warren nodded slowly. He was already drafting the letter he would send to his Harvard colleagues. He was already envisioning the studies he would carry out, the papers he'd publish, the talks he'd give. He didn't see the fear in Sarah Carter's eyes. He didn't realize he was about to make her children visible in a world that punished black people for being seen. News of the Carter twins traveled faster than Sarah had feared. Within a week of Dr. Warren's visit, 3 more doctors had come to Marblehead to test the children. Within 2 weeks, a reporter from the Boston Evening Transcript had shown up, asking questions and writing things down. Within a month, the story had been printed in newspapers all over New England. The headlines had different tones. The Boston Evening Transcript ran a piece called, "Remarkable Negro Children Display Unusual Mental Faculties." The article was cautiously complimentary, describing the twins' skills in detail, while carefully sidestepping any hint that these abilities might indicate racial equality. The Springfield Republican took another angle. Their headline asked, "Scientific Mystery. How can such minds exist in such bodies?" The article treated the twins as oddities, subjects to be investigated rather than children to be praised. The Providence Journal went even further. Their story, titled, "Nature's Impossibility Made Manifest," suggested the twins' abilities had to be the result of some unexplained biological oddity, a freak event that could never happen again and proved nothing about the overall potential of the Negro race. But other reactions emerged too. The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper, published in Boston by William Lloyd Garrison, ran a front-page story on the twins. The headline was straightforward: "Proof of Human Equality." The article argued that the Carter twins demonstrated exactly what abolitionists had always insisted, that mental differences between races came from environment and education, not from any natural biological inferiority. This article was the one that altered everything. William Lloyd Garrison was one of the most renowned abolitionists in America. He'd been putting out the Liberator since 1831, and anti-slavery activists nationwide and worldwide read his paper. When he wrote about the Carter twins, people took notice. Donations started arriving at Sarah Carter's little house. Letters came from strangers wanting to assist. Offers of education arrived from schools and tutors willing to teach the children for free. Invitations came from churches and lecture halls wanting the twins to appear before their groups and crowds. But other things also arrived. Threats came in the mail. Anonymous letters warned Sarah that her children would be hurt if they kept attracting attention. Rocks were thrown through her windows at night. A dead cat was left on her doorstep with a note reading, "Just know your place." The people of Marblehead, who had coexisted with Sarah Carter for years, started treating her differently. Neighbors who'd once been friendly now crossed the street to stay away. Customers who'd hired her for sewing and laundry abruptly found other seamstresses. The white families who'd employed her as a domestic let her go, one after another, until she had no income left. Sarah understood what was occurring. Her children's intelligence had upset the natural order. White people in Marblehead had been okay with a black family living among them, as long as that family stayed inferior, dependent, submissive. But the twins' abilities hinted at something white people couldn't accept: the chance that black minds could equal white minds. This possibility was more threatening than any physical danger. It undermined the entire foundation of slavery. It challenged the whole structure of American society. It made white people question things they'd been taught since birth. So they responded the only way they knew. They tried to destroy what they couldn't comprehend. In November of 1862, Sarah Carter made a choice that broke her heart. She sent her children away. Dr. Warren had set things up for the twins to attend the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. This school had been founded in 1837 by a Quaker named Richard Humphreys, and it was one of the rare places in America offering advanced education to black students. The school had agreed to accept Elijah and Ruth on full scholarships, with room and board covered by a wealthy abolitionist family. Sarah couldn't go with them. She had no money for the trip. She had no way to support herself in Philadelphia. And she knew that if she left Marblehead, she'd lose everything she'd built over the past 10 years, the small rented house, the few belongings she owned, the fragile stability she'd fought so hard to create. So she said goodbye to her children on a cold November morning at Marblehead Harbor. She held them both against her and told them things she'd never expressed before. "You are special," she whispered, "not because of what you can do with your minds. You're special because you're my children, because you're good and kind and strong, because you've survived in a world that didn't want you to survive." She pulled back and studied their faces, memorizing every detail. "The world will try to use you," she said. "White people will want to put you on display. They'll want to study you like animals. They'll want to prove their theories about race, one way or another, using your minds as proof." She took their hands in hers. "Don't let them," she said. "You're not proof. You're not specimens. You're not evidence of anything except your own existence. You're human beings. You deserve to be treated like human beings, and anyone who treats you as anything less doesn't deserve your cooperation." Elijah and Ruth boarded the ship that would take them to Philadelphia. They stood at the railing and watched their mother grow smaller and smaller until she was completely gone. They didn't cry. In their 8 years of life, they'd learned that crying changed nothing. They simply watched and remembered. The Institute for Colored Youth stood on Lombard Street in Philadelphia, in a neighborhood that had been home to free black people for generations. The school occupied a 3-story brick building that had once been a warehouse. Inside, classrooms had been created in the open spaces, equipped with donated desks and chairs, and filled with shelves of books gathered over many years of operation. When Elijah and Ruth arrived in December 1862, the school had roughly 120 students, ranging in age from 6 to 22. Most were children of free black families who'd lived in Philadelphia for years. A few were escaped slaves who'd made their way north through the Underground Railroad. All were there for the same purpose, to get an education that the white world didn't want them to have. The school's principal was a man named Ebenezer Bassett. He was 38, a graduate of Connecticut State Normal School, and one of the first black Americans to receive a college education. He'd been leading the Institute for Colored Youth since 1857, and under his direction, the school had become one of the finest educational institutions for black students in the country. When Mr. Bassett first encountered the Carter twins, he did what Dr. Warren had done. He tested them. But his tests were different. He wasn't interested in calculations or memory tricks. He cared about understanding. He sat with the twins in his office and asked them questions. Not math questions, not reading questions, but questions about the world. "Why do you think there's a war happening in this country?" he asked. Elijah and Ruth looked at each other. Over the years, they'd learned to communicate without speaking. A single glance between them could convey entire conversations. Ruth answered first. "Because people believe things that aren't true," she said. They believe some people are worth more than others. They believe the color of someone's skin tells you something about the contents of their mind. They believe these things because believing them makes it easier to do terrible things without feeling guilty. She paused. The war is about slavery, she continued. But slavery is about belief. If people stopped believing that black people were inferior, slavery couldn't exist. The war is really a war about what people believe. Mr. Bassett sat back in his chair. He'd been teaching for nearly a decade. He'd encountered many intelligent students, but he'd never heard an 8-year-old speak with such clarity about such complex matters. "And you, Elijah?" he asked. "What do you think?" Elijah considered the question carefully before responding. "I think my sister is right," he said. "But I think there's something else too. I think the war is also about money. The people who own slaves are rich because they don't have to pay for labor. If slavery ends, they'll lose their money, and people will do almost anything to keep their money." He looked at Mr. Bassett with those intense dark eyes. "I think the war won't end until one side has no money left to fight," he said. "And I think many, many people will die before that happens." Mr. Bassett nodded slowly. He understood now why Dr. Warren had been so amazed. These children didn't just have powerful minds, they had powerful insight. They could see the world with a clarity that most adults never achieved. But he also understood something Dr. Warren hadn't grasped. These children were in danger. Their intelligence made them valuable to people who wanted to exploit them. Their intelligence also made them threatening to those who wanted to preserve the existing order. They'd be sought after and hunted. They'd be celebrated and despised. They'd never be allowed to just live their lives peacefully. Mr. Bassett made a choice at that moment. He would protect these children. He would educate them. He would prepare them for the world they'd face. But he would also teach them something no one else could: how to survive. The years at the Institute for Colored Youth transformed Elijah and Ruth. They studied mathematics with a teacher named Octavius Cato, a young black man who'd later become one of the most important civil rights activists in Philadelphia's history. They studied literature with a woman named Fannie Jackson, who'd eventually become the first black woman to lead an institution of higher education in America. They studied science, history, languages, and philosophy with teachers who were among the finest black educators of their generation. But more significantly, they learned to manage their gifts. Mr. Bassett understood that raw intelligence displayed without wisdom could be dangerous. He'd seen bright young black men and women destroyed by white jealousy, their talents making them targets rather than assets. He knew Elijah and Ruth would need more than intellectual ability. To survive, they'd need judgment, restraint, the wisdom to know when to reveal their abilities and when to hide them. He taught them these lessons through careful guidance. "Your minds are like weapons," he told them one evening in his office. "A weapon that's always visible invites attack. A weapon that's hidden can be used when the time is right." He leaned forward in his chair. "There will be moments when you must show what you can do. There will be moments when powerful people need to see your abilities. But there will also be moments when showing your abilities will only bring you harm. You must learn to tell the difference." The twins listened carefully. They'd already started learning this lesson through their own experience. They'd seen how their intelligence had destroyed their mother's life in Marblehead. They'd seen how white people reacted when confronted with black minds that surpassed their own. They practiced hiding in plain sight. They learned to give answers that were correct but not too correct. They learned to display knowledge that was impressive but not threatening. They learned to read white people's reactions and adjust their behavior accordingly. It was exhausting. It was degrading. It was necessary. Meanwhile, the war continued. In January 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate states free. The news spread through Philadelphia's black community like wildfire. People celebrated in the streets. Churches held Thanksgiving services. For the first time in American history, the federal government had declared slavery wrong. But the celebration was tempered by reality. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in states that were in rebellion. It didn't free slaves in border states that had stayed in the Union. It didn't grant citizenship to freed slaves. It didn't give black people the right to vote. And it didn't end the war. The fighting continued through 1863 and into 1864. The battles grew larger and more horrific: Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Chickamauga. The names became linked with death on a scale Americans had never experienced. Elijah followed the war with obsessive attention. He collected newspapers and created maps showing army positions. He calculated casualty figures and supply logistics. He predicted battle outcomes based on available information. His predictions were remarkably precise. In March 1864, when he was 10 years old, he wrote a letter to a military officer named Colonel Robert Goodshaw, who'd commanded the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first black regiments in the Union Army. Colonel Shaw had been killed at the Battle of Fort Wagner in July 1863, but Elijah didn't know that when he wrote. The letter was returned to the Institute with a note explaining Colonel Shaw was dead. But someone had read Elijah's letter before returning it, and that someone had been impressed enough to share it with others. The letter contained Elijah's analysis of the war. He argued the Union would win, but only by adopting specific strategies. He suggested focusing on cutting Confederate supply lines rather than capturing territory. He recommended using black soldiers more extensively, not just for their numbers but for their motivation. He predicted the war would end sometime in 1865 if these strategies were followed. The letter eventually reached a newspaper editor in Boston who'd known Colonel Shaw. The editor published it under the headline, "A Child's Wisdom on the War." The article noted the letter had been written by a 10-year-old black boy at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. Once again, the Carter twins were in the newspapers, and once again, trouble followed. In April 1864, a group of white men came to the Institute for Colored Youth. There were 5 of them. They wore expensive suits and spoke with Southern accents. They claimed to be businessmen from Maryland, a border state where slavery remained legal. They said they'd heard about the remarkable Negro children and wanted to see them personally. Mr. Bassett met them at the school door. He didn't like what he saw. These men had the look of slave catchers, men who made their living hunting escaped slaves and returning them to bondage. "The children you're asking about aren't escaped slaves," Mr. Bassett said. "They were born free in Massachusetts. They're here legally under my protection, with full support from this institution." The leader, a tall man with a gray beard and cold eyes, smiled without warmth. "We're not suggesting otherwise," he said. "We simply want to meet these children. We've heard so much about them. Surely a brief visit wouldn't cause any harm." Mr. Bassett stood firm. "The children aren't available for visits," he said. "They're students at this school. Their education is my responsibility, and I don't believe your interest in them is academic." The men exchanged glances. Something passed between them, a silent communication Mr. Bassett didn't like. "Very well," the leader said. "Perhaps we'll return another time." They left without further incident. But Mr. Bassett knew they'd be back. That night, he called Elijah and Ruth to his office. Do you know who those men were? He asked. The twins looked at each other. Ruth spoke first. They weren't businessmen, she said. They were looking at us the way buyers look at merchandise. They want something from us, something specific. Elijah nodded in agreement. They were also lying about being from Maryland. He added. Their accents were wrong. One of them slipped and used a phrase common in South Carolina but not Maryland. I think they were from further south. Mr. Bassett wasn't surprised by their observations. He'd learned to trust their perceptions. I think they might try to take you, he said. I don't know for certain, but I believe they see you as valuable property. Children with minds like yours would be worth a great deal to certain people. Scientists wanting to study you. Circus owners wanting to display you, or worse. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I'm going to send you somewhere safe, he said. There's a community in Ohio near a town called Oberlin. It's a stronghold of abolitionist sentiment. The college there has been admitting black students for decades. There's a network of people who protect escaped slaves and free black people in danger. You'll be safe there. The twins didn't argue. They understood the danger. They understood their minds, which should have been their greatest asset, had become a liability in a world not ready to accept black intelligence. 2 days later, they boarded a train heading west. They didn't know it yet, but they wouldn't return to Philadelphia for many years. They wouldn't see Mr. Bassett again, and the men in expensive suits wouldn't stop looking for them. The trip to Ohio took 4 days. The twins traveled with a woman named Harriet Tubman. This wasn't the famous Harriet Tubman, who'd led hundreds of slaves to freedom through the Underground Railroad. This was a different woman using the same name, a common practice among black people in the Freedom Network. Using famous names provided cover and confusion, making it harder for slave catchers to track specific individuals. The woman traveling with Elijah and Ruth was 40 years old, with strong hands and watchful eyes. She didn't speak much during the journey. She watched, listened, and made sure no one was following them. They traveled by train when safe and by wagon when not. They stayed in houses, displaying certain signs in their windows, signs indicating safe harbor for black travelers. They ate meals prepared by strangers who asked no questions and expected no thanks. On the third night, while staying at a farmhouse in western Pennsylvania, the woman called Harriet sat with the twins and told them things they needed to know. You're being hunted, she said. Not just by those men who came to your school. There are others, people who've heard about your abilities, people who want to use you for their own purposes. She looked at them with eyes that had seen too much. Some want to study you. They think your minds can teach them about race and intelligence. They want to cut you open and look at your brains. They want to measure your skulls and weigh your organs. They don't see you as children. They see you as specimens. Ruth felt a chill run through her body. She'd known people looked at her differently. She hadn't known some wanted to dissect her. Others want to display you, Harriet continued. They want to put you on stages and charge money for people to see the Negro children who can think. They'd dress you in fine clothes, teach you tricks, and parade you before audiences like trained animals. They'd make you famous and themselves rich. Elijah clenched his fists. He'd always known his mind was different. He hadn't known his mind could be bought and sold like cotton or tobacco. And there are some, Harriet said, her voice dropping lower, who want to destroy you. They believe your existence threatens everything they hold dear. They believe if people see what you can do, if people believe black minds can equal white minds, then the entire system of slavery and segregation will collapse. They'd rather see you dead than see you prove them wrong. She leaned forward and took their hands. "This is the world you live in," she said. "This is the world you'll have to survive. I'm sorry. I wish I could tell you it'll get better, but I can't promise that. All I can promise is there are people who'll help you. People who believe in freedom. People who'll fight for you even when you can't fight for yourselves." She released their hands and stood. "Tomorrow we reach Ohio," she said. "You'll be safe there. But you must remember what I've told you. You must never forget you're hunted, and you must never stop running." The twins didn't sleep that night. They lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything Harriet had said. They thought about their mother alone in Marblehead, not knowing where her children were, or if they were safe. They thought about Mr. Bassett, who'd protected and taught them, then sent them away to protect them further. They thought about the men in expensive suits who wanted to take them. And they thought about the future, the long, uncertain, dangerous future stretching before them like an uncharted road. They were 10 years old. They'd already lived through more than most people experience in a lifetime. And they understood, in a way no child should have to, that their lives would never be easy. Their gifts would never be fully appreciated. Their minds would always be seen as anomalies, exceptions, impossibilities. But they also understood something else: they had each other. They'd been born together, grown together, developed their extraordinary abilities together. Their minds worked differently together than apart. They could communicate without words. They could solve problems by dividing them between their two perspectives. They could protect each other in ways no one else could. This was their secret. Not their intelligence, not their memory, not their ability to calculate or read or understand. Their secret was their bond, and as long as they had that bond, they would survive. Part 2. Oberlin, Ohio was unlike anywhere Elijah and Ruth had ever seen. The town had been founded in 1833 by Presbyterian ministers who believed racial equality was a Christian duty. From its earliest days, Oberlin welcomed black residents, black students, and escaped slaves seeking freedom. The college at the town center had been the first in America to regularly admit black students and women alongside white men. By 1864, when the Carter twins arrived, Oberlin had become the most racially integrated community in the United States. The twins were placed with a family named the Langstons. John Mercer Langston was a black lawyer educated at Oberlin College who'd become one of the most prominent black leaders in Ohio. His wife, Caroline, was a teacher running a small school for black children in their home. They had 3 children of their own and welcomed Elijah and Ruth as if they were family. For the first time since leaving Marblehead, the twins felt something close to safety. But safety, they'd learn, was always temporary. The first months in Oberlin focused on education. The twins enrolled in the preparatory department of Oberlin College, where students as young as 10 could begin studies, eventually leading to college admission. The curriculum was rigorous, designed to prepare students for the same education white students received at Harvard or Yale. For most students, this curriculum was challenging. For Elijah and Ruth, it wasn't challenging enough. Within weeks, their teachers recognized what Dr. Warren and Mr. Bassett had recognized before. These children weren't ordinary students. Their minds operated on a completely different level. They absorbed information at a seemingly impossible rate. They made connections between subjects their teachers had never considered. They asked questions revealing understanding far beyond their years. The head of the preparatory department, a stern New England woman named Professor Mary Jane Patterson, called the twins to her office after their first month of classes. Professor Patterson herself was remarkable. She'd been born free in North Carolina and moved to Ohio as a child. In 1862, she'd become the first black woman in American history to earn a bachelor's degree, graduating from Oberlin College with honors. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to be a black person with an exceptional mind in a world unwilling to acknowledge black excellence. She sat behind her desk and studied the twins with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Your teachers have reported your progress to me," she said. "They're astonished. They've never encountered students like you. They don't know what to do with you." The twins sat quietly, waiting for her to continue. "I've seen your examination results," Professor Patterson continued. "You've mastered material designed for students twice your age. You've done this in weeks. If you continue at this pace, you'll exhaust our entire curriculum within a year or two." She leaned forward, expression serious. "This creates a problem," she said. "Not for you. For us. We don't have resources to educate minds like yours. We don't have teachers who can sufficiently challenge you. We don't have textbooks advanced enough to hold your interest." Ruth spoke first. "What do you suggest we do?" Professor Patterson smiled slightly, a rare expression on her stern face. "I suggest we stop treating you as students," she said. "I suggest we start treating you as colleagues." This was an unusual arrangement, perhaps unprecedented. But Professor Patterson had authority to implement it, and she did. Beginning their second month in Oberlin, Elijah and Ruth were no longer simply students. They attended classes when they chose, but they also got access to the college library, where they could pursue any subject that interested them. They were invited to lectures meant for college students. They were encouraged to conduct their own research and share findings with faculty members working on similar questions. Elijah gravitated toward mathematics and military strategy. He spent hours in the library reading about Napoleon's campaigns, ancient generals' tactics, the principles of logistics and supply. He applied his mathematical mind to warfare problems, developing theories about optimal troop movements and resource allocation that impressed his professors. Ruth gravitated toward languages and history. She taught herself Greek and Hebrew, in addition to the Latin she'd started learning. She read primary sources in their original languages, discovering nuances translations missed. She developed particular interest in slavery's history, tracing its roots through ancient civilizations, understanding how human bondage had evolved over millennia. Together, they began seeing the world in ways most people never would. But even in Oberlin, even surrounded by supportive people, the twins couldn't escape their situation's reality. The men who'd come to Philadelphia didn't give up their search. In March 1865, 3 months before the Civil War ended, a stranger arrived in Oberlin asking questions. He was a white man in his 40s, well-dressed with a polished manner suggesting education and wealth. He said his name was Dr. Samuel Morton, a scientist from Philadelphia researching human intelligence. He said he'd heard about 2 exceptional Negro children studying at Oberlin and wished to meet them for academic purposes. Dr. Morton wasn't who he claimed to be. The real doctor. Samuel Morton had been a Philadelphia physician who'd spent decades collecting human skulls and measuring them to prove white people had larger brains than black people. His work had justified slavery and racial discrimination. He died in 1851, 14 years before this stranger arrived in Oberlin using his name. John Mercer Langston was first to recognize the deception. As a lawyer, he'd learned to research people making claims, and he quickly discovered Dr. Samuel Morton was dead. He confronted the stranger at his hotel. "I don't know who you are," Langston said, "but I know who you're not. You're not Dr. Morton. Dr. Morton died 14 years ago, and I know what you want the Carter children. You won't have them." The stranger's polished manner vanished. His face twisted into something ugly. "Those children are valuable," he said. "More valuable than you can imagine. There are people who pay a great deal for minds like theirs, and there are other people who pay a great deal to ensure minds like theirs are never seen again." He stepped closer to Langston, voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You can't protect them forever. Sooner or later, they'll leave Oberlin. Sooner or later, they'll be vulnerable. And when that happens, we'll be waiting." He turned and walked away, leaving Langston standing in the hotel lobby with cold fear in his heart. That night, Langston gathered the twins and told them everything. He didn't soften the truth or try to shield them from danger. He believed they deserved to know what they faced. Ruth listened with a calm expression, masking her churning emotions. "Who are these people?" she asked. "Who's paying them?" Langston shook his head. "I don't know for certain, but I have suspicions. There are wealthy men in the South who've made fortunes from slavery. The war's going badly for them. They know they're going to lose. They know slavery will end. And they're looking for ways to prove that even without chains, black people will remain inferior." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Children like you threaten that belief," he said. "If you exist, if you can do what you do, then everything they believe is wrong. Some want to study you, to find some explanation preserving their worldview. Others want to destroy you before you can prove them wrong." Elijah had been silent throughout this conversation. Now he spoke, his voice steady despite the fear he felt. "What can we do?" he asked. Langston looked at him with respect. This child, this 11-year-old boy, was asking not how to hide, but how to fight. "For now, you can continue your studies," Langston said. "You can continue developing your minds. Knowledge is power, and the more you know, the more powerful you become. But you must also be careful. You must not draw unnecessary attention, and you must be ready to move at a moment's notice if danger becomes too great." The twins nodded. They understood. They'd been running since they were 8. They'd continue running as long as necessary. But someday, they knew, running wouldn't be enough. Someday they'd have to stand and fight. The Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, when General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The news reached Oberlin 3 days later. Church bells rang throughout town. People poured into streets, celebrating, weeping, embracing strangers. After 4 years of bloodshed, after more than 600,000 deaths, the war was finally over. The Union had been preserved. Slavery had been destroyed. But the celebration was short-lived. 5 days after Lee's surrender, on April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He died the following morning without regaining consciousness. Lincoln's death cast a shadow over everything. The man who'd guided the nation through its darkest hour, who'd issued the Emancipation Proclamation, who'd promised to bind up the nation's wounds, was gone. In his place stood Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee man whose commitment to black equality was uncertain at best. Ruth understood immediately what Lincoln's death meant for people like her and Elijah. She was 11 now, her understanding of history and politics grown sophisticated. She'd studied power patterns throughout human civilization. She'd seen how progress could reverse, freedom could be taken, how the powerful always found ways to maintain dominance. "Lincoln was the only thing protecting us," she said to Elijah the night they learned of the assassination. "Without him, everything changes." Elijah had been thinking the same. His military strategy studies had taught him winning a war was only the beginning. Holding peace was often harder than winning victory. "The people who hunted us before will be stronger now," he said. "They'll have allies in government. They'll have time to rebuild power, and they won't forget about us. He was right. The years following the war, known as Reconstruction, were a time of hope and horror for Black Americans. On one hand, Congress passed constitutional amendments, formally abolishing slavery, granting citizenship to Black people, and guaranteeing voting rights regardless of race. Black men were elected to Congress. Black communities built schools and churches. For a brief moment, true equality seemed possible. On the other hand, violence against Black people increased dramatically. White supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan emerged across the South, terrorizing Black families and murdering Black leaders. Laws were passed restricting Black freedom in everything but name. Reconstruction's promise was betrayed almost as soon as it was made. Elijah and Ruth watched these developments with growing concern. They were teenagers now, their minds sharper than ever, their understanding deeper than most adults would ever achieve. And they understood the fight for Black equality was far from over. It had barely begun. In 1868, when the twins were 14, they made a decision shaping the rest of their lives. They decided to use their gifts in service of their people. The decision came after a long conversation with John Mercer Langston, who'd become like a father to them. Langston had recently been appointed first dean of the law department at Howard University in Washington, D.C. He was preparing to move his family to the nation's capital, and he wanted the twins to come with him. Howard University had been founded in 1867 to provide higher education for Black Americans. It was named after General Oliver Otis Howard, who'd led the Freedmen's Bureau and committed his life to helping formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. The university was small and underfunded, but it represented something important, a commitment to Black intellectual development at the highest level. Langston believed the twins belonged at Howard, not as students, but as teachers. "You've learned everything Oberlin can teach," he said. "You've read more books than most professors. Your minds are ready for work that matters. And Howard needs people like you." Ruth hesitated. She was only 14. How could she teach adults twice her age? Langston smiled. He'd anticipated this objection. "You won't teach classes in the traditional sense," he said. "You'll work as researchers. You'll help faculty members with projects. You'll write papers published under other names. Your contributions will be hidden, but they'll be real." He leaned forward, expression serious. "This is how power works," he said. "Not through public recognition, but through quiet influence. You'll shape the thinking of people who shape the world. You'll plant seeds growing into forests, and no one will ever know the seeds came from you." The twins understood what he offered. It wasn't fame or glory. It was something more valuable. Purpose. They agreed to go to Washington, but before leaving Oberlin, they received news changing everything. Their mother was dying. Sarah Carter had never recovered from losing her children. After they left Marblehead, she'd descended into poverty and despair. The white community that shunned her continued shunning her. The few local Black families did what they could, but resources were limited. She'd developed consumption, the disease later called tuberculosis. By the time word reached Oberlin, she'd been sick for months. Doctors said she had weeks left, perhaps less. The twins faced an impossible choice. Going to Marblehead meant exposing themselves to people who'd hunted them for years. The men wanting to capture, study, or destroy them were still out there. Returning to Massachusetts would put them in danger. But their mother was dying. She was alone. She'd sacrificed everything for them. Could they let her die without seeing her one last time? They didn't hesitate. They boarded a train heading east. The journey to Marblehead took 3 days. The twins traveled under assumed names, wearing plain clothes, making them look like ordinary black children. They avoided eye contact with white passengers. They spoke as little as possible. They made themselves invisible. But invisibility has limits. On the second day, as the train passed through Pennsylvania, Elijah noticed a man watching them from across the car. The man was white, middle-aged, with the weathered face of someone spending life outdoors. He wore clothes of a farmer or laborer, but his eyes were too sharp, too calculating. He wasn't what he appeared. Elijah leaned close to Ruth and whispered without moving his lips, "We're being watched." The man in the brown coat by the window. Ruth didn't turn her head. She'd already noticed the man. She'd been tracking his movement since he boarded at the last station. "I know," she whispered back. "There's another at the front of the car. They're working together." Elijah's mind raced through possibilities. They could get off at the next station, but that would only delay confrontation. They could try hiding in the crowd, but there was no crowd on this rural stretch of railroad. They could fight, but they were two teenagers against grown men, probably armed. "The train's slowing down," Ruth said. "We'll reach a station in about 3 minutes. When doors open, we run." Elijah nodded almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only plan they had. The next 3 minutes felt like hours. The train decelerated gradually, landscape outside changing from forest to farmland to a small town's outskirts. The man in the brown coat stood casually and began moving toward the twins' end of the car. The man at the front did the same. They were closing in. The train stopped. Doors opened. Elijah and Ruth exploded into motion. They'd always been fast runners, their young bodies lean and strong from years of activity. They burst through the door onto the platform, weaving through the crowd of waiting passengers. Behind them, shouts of surprise and anger came as the two men tried following. The twins didn't look back. They ran through the station, past the ticket counter, out onto the town's main street. They had no idea where they were. They had no idea where to go. They simply ran. A hand reached out and grabbed Ruth's arm. She spun, ready to fight, ready to scream, but the hand belonged to a black woman. She was old, maybe 60, with gray hair and kind eyes. She wore a domestic servant's simple dress, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "This way," the woman said. "Quickly, before they see you." There was no time to question. The twins followed the woman down an alley, through a gate, into a small yard behind a house. The woman opened a cellar door and gestured for them to descend. They climbed down into darkness. The door closed above them. They heard the woman's footsteps moving away. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, after what felt like hours but was probably minutes, the cellar door opened again. The old woman climbed down carrying a lantern. "You're safe for now," she said. "Those men searched the station but didn't find you. They've boarded another train heading further east. They think you're still running." Ruth found her voice. "Who are you? How did you know to help us?" The woman smiled. "My name's Patience. I work for the family owning this house. I knew to help because I was told to watch for 2 children who might need protection. A message came last week from a man named Langston. He said, you might be passing through. He said to keep you safe." The twins looked at each other. Even from Ohio, John Mercer Langston was protecting them. He'd anticipated danger. He'd arranged help along their route. They weren't alone. They spent 2 days hiding in Patience's cellar. She brought food, water, news information. She told them the men who'd followed were still in the area, asking questions, offering rewards for information about 2 black children traveling together. But she also told them something else. Their mother was still alive. Sarah Carter had defied doctors' predictions. She was clinging to life, refusing to die until seeing her children one more time. She knew they were coming. She'd felt it somehow, the way mothers sometimes feel things they can't explain. On the third day, Patience arranged a wagon to take the twins the final miles to Marblehead. They traveled at night, hidden under blankets in the wagon's back. The driver was a black man who asked no questions and offered no conversation. They arrived at their mother's house just before dawn. The house was smaller than Ruth remembered. Paint was peeling. Windows were cracked. The garden their mother had kept so carefully was overgrown with weeds. But the door was open, and a candle burned in the window. They went inside. Sarah Carter lay on a narrow bed in the main room's corner. She was thin, terribly thin. Her skin stretched tight over bones too prominent. Her hair had gone gray. Her eyes were closed. But when she heard her children's footsteps, those eyes opened. And despite everything, despite illness, poverty, years of separation, she smiled. "You came," she whispered. "I knew you would." The twins knelt beside her bed. They took her hands, one on each side, and for the first time in 6 years, they were a family again. Sarah lived for 3 more days. In those 3 days, she told her children everything she'd never been able to tell them before. She told them about her own childhood, her parents, their family's history stretching back generations. She told them about the father they'd never known, a sailor who died at sea before they were born. She told them about the night they were born, how she'd held them in her arms and immediately known they were special, and she told them what she wanted them to do with their lives. "Don't hide," she said, her voice weak but clear. "I told you to hide when you were children. I told you to pretend to be ordinary. I was trying to protect you, but I was wrong." She gripped their hands with surprising strength. "You can't hide what you are," she said. "You can't pretend to be less than you are. The world will always try to make you smaller, to put you in boxes, to tell you what you can't do. But you mustn't listen. You must stand tall. You must let them see what you are. You must show them what black people can become when given the chance." She took a shuddering breath. "I won't see it," she said. "I won't see what you'll become. But I know it'll be magnificent. I know you'll change the world, and I know somewhere, somehow, I'll be watching." She died on the morning of the 4th day with her children holding her hands. They buried her in a small cemetery on Marblehead's outskirts. The grave was unmarked. There was no minister, no ceremony, no one present except the twins and the undertaker who'd agreed to help. But as they stood by the grave, Ruth spoke words their mother would have wanted to hear. "We won't hide," Ruth said. "We won't pretend. We'll show the world what you always knew we could be, and we'll make you proud." Elijah added his own promise. "We'll fight," he said. "Not with weapons, not with violence, but with our minds. We'll prove everything they believe about us is wrong. We'll tear down their lies with truth, and we'll never, ever give up." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then they turned and walked away from the grave, away from Marblehead, away from the life they'd known as children. They were 14 years old. They were orphans. And they were ready to change the world. The twins arrived in Washington, D.C. in autumn 1868. The nation's capital was a city of contradictions. Great government buildings stood alongside neighborhoods of desperate poverty. White politicians debated black Americans' future in marble chambers, while black families struggled to survive just blocks away. Freedom had been declared, but equality remained a distant dream. Howard University was on a hill overlooking the city. The campus was small, just a few buildings surrounded by muddy fields, but what it lacked in physical grandeur, it made up for in ambition. The twins began work immediately. They were officially enrolled as students, but this was a formality. In reality, they worked alongside faculty, contributing to research projects shaping Black education's future. Elijah focused on mathematics and economics, developing theories about how Black communities could build wealth despite systemic discrimination. Ruth focused on history and law, documenting slavery's crimes and building legal arguments for reparations and equal rights. Their contributions were hidden, as Langston had promised. Papers were published under professors' names. Speeches were delivered by others. The twins remained in shadows, their influence invisible but powerful. But shadows can only hide so much. In 1871, when the twins were 17, Ruth wrote a legal brief arguing for federal protection of Black voting rights. The brief was technically authored by a Howard professor, but the arguments were entirely Ruth's. The brief was used by Republican members of Congress to support what became known as the Enforcement Acts, a series of laws designed to combat the Ku Klux Klan and protect Black voters in the South. The laws passed. The Klan was temporarily suppressed. Black men voted in record numbers in the 1872 elections. But someone noticed. A journalist from a Southern newspaper had been investigating the origins of the legal arguments used to pass the Enforcement Acts. He traced the brief back to Howard University. He discovered the credited author, the professor, hadn't actually written the document. He dug deeper, and he found the twins. The article appeared in December 1872 under the headline, "Negro Children Control Congress." The story was sensationalized, exaggerated, filled with racist assumptions. But at its core was a true revelation. 2 Black teenagers had been secretly shaping federal policy for years. Their minds had produced work-changing laws and influencing elections. Their intelligence had penetrated government's highest levels. The reaction was immediate and violent. Congress launched an investigation. Howard University was threatened with loss of federal funding. Death threats flooded in from across the country. A group of men attempted to set fire to the building where the twins lived. But something else happened too. Black newspapers nationwide celebrated the twins as heroes. Churches read their names from pulpits. Parents told their children about Elijah and Ruth Carter, proof that Black minds were equal to any on earth. The twins became symbols of everything Black Americans could achieve if given the chance. They'd spent their whole lives hiding. Now, finally, they stepped into the light. In January 1873, Elijah and Ruth Carter gave their first public speech at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. The church was packed. People stood in aisles, sat on windowsills, crowded outside trying to hear through open doors. The twins walked to the front and looked out at the sea of Black faces, waiting to hear what they'd say. Ruth spoke first. "They told us we couldn't think," she said. "They told us our minds were inferior. They told us slavery was justified because we were less than human. They told us these things because they wanted to believe them, because believing made it easier to do evil." She paused, letting words settle. "We are proof they were wrong. Not because we're special, not because we're different from other Black people. We're proof. Because we were given a chance to learn, to develop our minds, to become what we were always capable of becoming." She gestured to the crowd. "Every person in this room has the same capacity. Every Black child in America has the same potential. The only difference is opportunity. And that's what we must fight for. Not just freedom, not just equality under law, but opportunity. The chance for every Black child to discover what their mind can do." Elijah spoke next. "Our mother told us something before she died," he said. "She told us not to hide. She told us to let the world see what we are. She told us the world will always try to make us smaller, but we mustn't listen." He looked out at faces watching him, faces filled with hope, pain, determination. "We've been fighting this battle our whole lives," he said. "We'll continue fighting as long as we live. But we can't fight alone. Every one of you is a soldier in this war. Every one of you has a mind that can be sharpened, a voice that can be raised, a contribution that can be made." He raised his fist. "They want us silent. They want us invisible. They want us to accept our place at society's bottom. But we won't be silent. We won't be invisible. We won't accept what they tell us we must accept." His voice rose to fill the church. "We are Elijah and Ruth Carter. We are black. We are gifted, and we are just the beginning." The church erupted in cheers. People wept openly. Strangers embraced. For a moment in that sacred space, equality's dream felt possible. The twins stood together, holding hands as their mother had held theirs on her deathbed. They'd come so far from a small Massachusetts fishing village. Through fear and flight and loss, through years of hiding and years of work, to this moment standing before their people, claiming their place in history. But their story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The following decades held both triumph and tragedy. Elijah Carter became one of his generation's most influential economists. He developed theories about wealth creation in oppressed communities that wouldn't be fully appreciated until more than a century after his death. He advised black business owners, trained black accountants, established investment funds, helping black families build generational wealth despite obstacles. Ruth Carter became a legal scholar whose work laid groundwork for civil rights arguments, eventually reaching the Supreme Court. She trained dozens of black lawyers. She wrote briefs challenging segregation, discrimination, disenfranchisement. She never argued a case herself. Women weren't permitted, but her words were spoken by others in courtrooms nationwide. Together, they founded schools, established newspapers, built organizations continuing their work long after they were gone. But they also faced defeats. Reconstruction ended in 1877, and with it ended federal commitment to protecting black rights. The Ku Klux Klan resurged. Jim Crow laws spread across the South. Progress made was systematically dismantled. The men who'd hunted the twins never stopped. Over the years, there were assassination attempts, arson, threats against everyone they loved. They learned to live with danger as a constant companion, and there were personal losses. John Mercer Langston died in 1897, leaving a void never filled. Friends and colleagues passed. The community nurturing them grew smaller year by year, but they never stopped fighting. In 1910, when the twins were 56, they gave their final public speech together at the inaugural conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP had been founded just a year earlier, building on work people like the Carters had been doing for decades. Ruth was frail now, her health damaged by years of relentless work. Elijah stood beside her, hair white but eyes still sharp. "We've lived long enough to see great changes," Ruth said, voice weaker but still clear. "When we were born, slavery was law. When we die, we'll leave a generation knowing nothing but freedom. That's progress." She paused to catch breath. "But we've also lived long enough to see how easily progress reverses, how quickly freedom can be taken, how persistent hatred is." She looked at young faces in the audience, faces carrying the struggle forward. "Don't be discouraged," she said. "Don't despair. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. You may not live to see victory. We won't live to see victory, but victory will come. It must, because truth is stronger than lies, and love is stronger than hate." Elijah spoke last. "Our mother told us when we were children we must show the world what black people can become when given the chance. We've tried to do that. We've succeeded in some ways, failed in others, but we've never stopped trying." He took his sister's hand. "Now the work passes to you. You must continue what we started. You must build on what we built. You must never give up, never surrender, never accept the world as it is when it could be so much better. He looked at the audience one final time. We are Elijah and Ruth Carter. We were told our minds were impossible. We proved nothing is impossible. And we pass that lesson to you now and forever. Nothing is impossible. Ruth died 3 months later, spring 1910. Elijah followed that autumn. They were buried side by side in a Washington, D.C. cemetery not far from Howard University's campus. Their headstone bore a simple inscription: 2 minds, 1 purpose, freedom. The Carter twins' story faded from popular memory in following decades. History books focused on other figures, other moments. Their contributions were absorbed into the larger civil rights narrative, their individual names forgotten. But their legacy lived on. Every black child receiving education, every black lawyer arguing for justice, every black economist building community wealth, every black family rising from poverty through education and hard work. All were beneficiaries of what the Carter twins started, and somewhere in Howard University's archives, boxes of papers remain unexamined. Letters and documents bearing handwriting of 2 children who shouldn't have been able to write what they wrote. Evidence of minds that shouldn't have existed according to their time's beliefs. The twins' story proves something that never should have needed proving. It proves intelligence isn't determined by race. Potential isn't limited by circumstance. The human mind, given chance to develop, can achieve impossibilities. It proves 2 children born in poverty, hunted by hatred, orphaned by injustice, can still change the world. And it proves the world, despite all evidence, can change. Not quickly, not easily, not without cost. But it can change. That's the lesson of Elijah and Ruth Carter. That's their gift to us. That's the secret they carried. The impossible secret that couldn't be explained. The secret was hope. The secret was resilience. The secret was love. And that secret, unlike the twins themselves, can never die. It lives on in every person refusing limits, in every child daring to dream, in every mind reaching for something greater than what the world says possible. The Carter twins lit a flame in 1862. That flame still burns today, and it will keep burning as long as there are people willing to tend it. As long as there are people willing to believe.